I'm skeptical of the claim.
I'm skeptical.
We are skeptical
Of claims for the ability of
random mutations
And natural selection.
to account for the complexity of life.
I wrote about 10 icons of evolution in my book. I could have written about more, but I had to stop somewhere.
Survival of the fittest has had a disastrous history.
Does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian.
We don't even know how to define life, let alone knowing how to spark it to begin.
School taught you that we came from apes. They said that this theory was so solidified in reality that it's practically a fact. They lied to you. Lock in with me and let me fix your brain. Now, before all of the biology majors start flexing in the comments down below with their PhDs, classical music, and British accents, let me explain myself. I am not anti-evolution. I do believe that human beings actually have evolved. We have seen this, we can measure this, it's an undeniable fact, but it's on a much smaller scale, and more importantly, a scale that we can actually test. These can be measured within human populations that I'll explain later on in the video, but I do believe that humans actually have evolved. Let's clear up the first of the biggest lies. With Neo-Darwinism, the evidence revolves around the theory and not the other way around. The bias will become a lot more clear to you as you watch the rest of this video. School left this part out of the textbooks, but Darwin himself actually said, analogy would lead me one step farther, namely to believe that all animals and plants are descendant from some one prototype. But analogy would be a deceitful guide. But you're taught in school that he said the exact opposite, aren't you? That Darwin himself believed that we all came from one single prototype, when in reality, in his books, he says that he doesn't believe that. That's because school taught you Neo-Darwinism, not Darwinian evolution. The differences are vast. Darwinian evolution was based on Darwin's observations. The theory is based within the scientific method and does not have such far-fetched conclusions. For an example, he believed in natural selection within reasonable limits that would be an undeniable truth. Neo-Darwinism is a fork of Darwinism. It's modified and often politically charged. It tries to find definite answers deeper than Darwin ever claimed. It does this through an artificial epigenetics and genetic mutations beyond the normal three, which are insertions, deletions, and duplications. This theory brings in specific gene expression and draws bold conclusions from vague evidences. I'll explain more later on in this video, but this is the most known theory, and Darwin is wrongly credited for the creation of this theory. It's what you're taught in school, and it's not the truth. The Neo-Darwinist leading theory of how they assume life started on Earth was by something called abiogenesis. To put simply, a pond of amino acids got heated from hydrothermal vents in the ocean floor that eventually evolved into all different types of life. Natural selection over time plus random DNA copying mistakes somehow equals all of life on Earth. It's a sad attempt at drawing a conclusion of the origin of life. In my opinion, it's unbelievable to even accept this theory. Even if this was possible, it doesn't go into the maintenance and subsequent reproduction of the organism that was created. Furthermore, prerequisites to this theory such as spontaneous generation, which is basically saying that something can come from nothing, or life can come from no life, which is obviously not true, was actually disproven in the 19th century by a French chemist named Louis Pasteur. And before him, it was thought that if you close a jar of milk and then bacteria grows inside the jar of milk, it was because the milk would produce this life spontaneously, and that the life would come out of nowhere, almost as if it was a magical creation. He came to the conclusion that there were already organisms alive inside, and the bacteria there we just couldn't see. So that's why it would grow, because it was always there. It didn't just come out of nowhere. Additionally, abiogenesis has never been recreated, and the closest scientists have come to recreating it is the creation of simple peptides using artificial conditions. The peptides created were not capable of having a secondary structure, let alone a globular structure, whilst at the same time ignoring all the conditions required to keep that enzyme stable and prevent it from denaturing artificially. This is very likely to not ever have happened naturally. R. Graham Cooks, who serves as the distinguished professor of analytical chemistry, said that proteins are formed from amino acids by loss of water, and loss of water in water will not occur because the process will be reversed by the water. This is thermodynamically forbidden. There are a very large number of studies showing peptide formation, but they all use catalyst or modified amino acids to make species unlikely to exist naturally. It simply just couldn't have happened naturally, and believing in so is a far stretch outside the bounds of reality. There are different stages of human evolution in the theory, the latest of which are Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapien, respectively. The debate here is, do we have a common ancestor to these species? Are they our ancestors that we've evolved from, or are they a subspecies? And if we didn't evolve from them, then why did they go extinct? Did we just wipe them out and smoke them all and outperform them to their extinction? The latest claim isn't too hard to believe, actually. If you look at the nature of our species, what would we do if somebody just claimed a brand new land, a brand new territory on the planet Earth? Immediate war would be waged to gain control of the resources and of the land. We don't shake their hand and, team up like we're playing a squad in Fortnite. We go in for the kill and take all the land that we could for our own monetary and beneficial gain. That's the nature of our species. Literally, every single country would wage war against this little small country that has no army, because what are they going to do? Stop us? We want the money and resources, so we'll do it anyways. That's how we're built. The oldest Homo sapien fossil on Earth is a skull found in Jebel Urhoud, Morocco. It was thought to initially be 40,000 years old, then it was recently reappraised in the year 2017 to actually be roughly 300,000 years old. Now this is crucial because it shakes up the entire theory of evolution by slowing down the timeline way further than is possible to hold the current theory. The difference between our skull currently and the 300,000-year-old skull is from Jebel Urhoud was that it had a double-arched eyebrow ridge, a larger and protruding nasal cavity, a broader face, and a smaller brain casing. If that's all that happened in 300,000 years, then how many years ago were we apes? Now, if the end of Homo erectus was set to end around 27 to 100,000 years ago, and this Jebel Urhoud Homo sapien, like us, was alive 300,000 years ago, then that must mean that erectus and sapien were alive together. However, the current theory claims that we went back further and further in stages, that our species was once their species. Now this is problematic because not only do we have fossil records showing us that Homo erectus and Homo sapien, like us, being alive at one point, but we also have Homo habilis and Homo erectus being alive and hunting within 1 kilometer of each other at the same exact time. For these to be alive at the same time and in the same geographical region shows us that they weren't ancestors of each other, they weren't going back in stages, and it'd be a lot more rational to assume that they were separate entities entirely. So it's not far-fetched to believe that one Homo class outperformed and wiped out the other from habilis to erectus to sapien. Another point of argument is that the Earth didn't exist infinitely, so we have a timeline that we have to work with. The Earth has been a viable place of life for the last 4.6 billion years, which might make sense to you. However, we've had many mass extinction events such as the Cretaceous Paleogene event, reducing the timeline of evolution to about 66 million years only. So with that in mind, the timeline no longer adds up. If we were still Homo sapiens for the last 300,000 years minimum, and have undergone limited evolution since, then how many years ago did we evolve from a pond of amino acids again? Doesn't make sense. These fossils are probably the first thing that come to mind when you think about human evolution. A lot of these models that we've used to visualize evolution are actually so weak in authenticity that one of them is a fully fledged human-like ape model with the legs and arms and feet and everything that's fully constructed from a single tooth of a pig, my boy! When Lucy was first discovered in the 1970s, people thought that she was the missing link between humans and apes. Now, experts usually agree that this was just a 3-foot-tall chimpanzee, not a human in the making. The reason that they thought so was because of their neo-Darwinian presuppositions. Remember when I mentioned earlier that the evidence fits around the theory and not the other way around? We didn't recover any feet or hand bones from Lucy, but it was assumed that she had human feet and human hands. This further proves my point that there is a definite bias here. The Hannover Sandman was made by an anthropology professor named Rainer Prosch. He falsified age determinations of fossils during his 30-year career, and in 2010 made up data to support his claims. He literally risked and lost his entire 30 years worth of work to falsify the Hannover Sandman and ruin his entire life worth of credibility. This is the fattest L I've seen anybody take in my life, and you can see that he had this determination to prove neo-Darwinian evolution to us to a point where he risked his entire life worth of credibility for it. The bias is definitely there. The Piltdown Man is one of the most famous fossil fabrications there are. 3 different evolutionary biologists collaborated on this project. It's a human skull with a modern ape jaw. They thought that mixing the two would fabricate the missing link, but it didn't. Now they just look stupid on iamLucid's YouTube channel that you're subscribed to. You're subscribed to my channel, right? You're subscribed to my channel, right? You're subscribed. The Nebraska Man. This is a fully constructed, fully fledged human from a wild pig tooth. I can't make this up. The amount of creativity that went into this one was immaculate. How they turn a whole body, a model of a whole body with the arms, legs, bones, everything from a tooth of a pig. The Cardiff Giant was made by George Hull, who was an atheist. He lost a debate and wanted to prove how easily he can fool people of religion to believe in their biblical giants. So he hired some guys $3,000 to make their own 10-foot biblical giant and then buried it. This fake fossil ended up selling for $23,000, which of today's time would equal $500,000. Unbelievable. The Cardiff Giant was believed to be real and was exhibited in multiple museums. 3,000 people actually came out to see it because they thought it was totally authentic. And then we ended up realizing that it wasn't real because he got drunk at a party and revealed that it was fake himself. The Pecking Man was supposed to be the missing link, but then somehow all of the evidence has disappeared. I'm not joking. It's supposed to be like a Homo erectus human being that lived in China, that had huge protrusive eye sockets, but I guess we'll never know because it's gone and it disappeared out of nowhere. They never taught you this in school, but Darwin was a racist. He was also openly sexist, and if he was alive today, he would be cancelled on Twitter and his entire theory would have been rejected. The most shocking was when he wrote in his book, written in 1871, titled The Descent of Man, where he says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure out what he's talking about when he says the savage races. He published this book roughly 62 years before the event took place in Germany that I can't say the name of in this video. Again, use your context clues. They're actually deeply connected. I'll explain how in the next point. But Darwin believed that the white races were evolutionarily more advanced than the black races. Darwin's views of gender were not much better. He says that men were more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women with a more inventive genius. His brain is absolutely larger. The formation of her skull is said to be intermediate between the child and the man. Darwin also says, and I quote, "The chief distinction of the intellectual powers of two sexes is shown by man attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up, than women can, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands." He added, "Thus man has ultimately become superior to woman." Not me saying this, but your boy Darwin. But it doesn't stop there, because Darwin would tell the Reverend Charles Kingsley in a letter dated February 6, 1862, "It is very true what you say about the higher races of men when high enough, replacing and clearing off lower races. In 500 years, how the Anglo-Saxon race would have spread and exterminated whole nations, and in consequence, how much the human race viewed as a unit would have risen in rank. Remember what risks the nation of Europe ran not so many centuries ago, being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous of such an idea was. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turks hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world." Not only did he predict this, but he created this ideology and gave room to prove it scientifically, which made a lot of negative and nasty things happen throughout history because of his theory. And no, if you live in the USA, you're not safe either, because there were previously anti-miscegenation laws in the USA which made it a crime to let somebody categorized under a different race. Darwin's theory helped justify these claims with his scientifically backed racism. These inherent beliefs have been pushed into the theory of evolution from the very beginning and have remained instilled within it, making it extremely difficult to differentiate the difference between fact and opinion. This resonates with the modern theory as well, because the evidence seems to revolve around the conclusions and not the conclusions revolving around the evidence, which is how it should be for any scientific method. This has actually led to more than 1,000 biologists raising doubts and skepticism about the theory of evolution in a joint statement where they say, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged." These are over 1,000 scientists, not your boy that's a YouTuber. The term eugenics and its modern field of study were first coined by Francis Galton in 1883-1887, drawing on the recent work of his half-cousin Charles Darwin. The practice of controlled selective breeding of a human population to improve the genetic composition, basically forcing survival of the fittest onto a population on what the leader defines as fittest. I'm sure we can all think of a time in history where this happened. Obviously can't say the name of that thing. Matter of fact, Darwinism actually played a huge role in the radical ideology. It's how they justify doing what they did with the use of propaganda and a warped pseudoscience and pseudo-moralistic view of Darwinism, they were able to convince thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that what they were doing was actually okay and was actually good for the human race. He really thought that he was lending a helping hand to the evolutionary struggle for existence, as he literally quotes himself, the really bad guy in history that I can't say the name of. Actually, I would love to get into this deeper and tell you exactly what happened and how the two extremely horrific events that happened on the human earth are linked with Darwinism. So they forced survival of the fittest on everybody around them. Oh yeah, I can't even mention more about this. To learn the full part of the eugenics part of this video, which I can't say on YouTube, to get the full in-depth version of this video, go to iamLucid.com, where I will have this section in specific so that you can learn more about the nitty-gritty parts of Darwinism that school will never ever teach you. It's on iamLucid.com. Once you become a member and support your boy, you can also get a V-card while you're there. It's stainless steel V-card, my boy. Darwin actually wrote private letters that were not made to be public, but they obviously are now, to his Christian friend, where he was explaining that he was having a hard time believing in the Christian faith. He had a hard time believing in theism in general, but he did know that a God had to have existed. There has to be a God that has made all of this. The design argument still astonished him, and he describes in his own writing that there is a impossibility of conceiving that this grand and wondrous universe with our conscious selves arose by chance. So Darwin still knew that there was no way this could have happened by accident. But Darwin does also say that he couldn't overlook the difficulty from the immense amount of suffering throughout the world. The guy did have a very, very hard life. His daughter died very young. He went through extreme hardships throughout his life, so I can see why he thinks this way. But at the same time, any person of religion will tell you, yeah, Darwin, that's the point. That's why we're here, to be tested. Life is not made to be fun and easy and happy all day long. But then Darwin also goes on to say, and quote me, I'm telling you, this is exactly what he says, word for word, verbatim. Tell this to your teachers in school. Darwin also says, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. He also writes this, as if it doesn't make any more sense to you, he also writes, I had no intention to write atheistically. Darwin is saying this. He had no intention of doing it, but people somehow still were misinterpreting his words and were warping it for their own atheistic agenda to make everybody feel like they couldn't believe in God, actually. The reason that he makes his stance very clear is because his work was actually, at the time, being used as a way to promote atheism, or to prove atheism, or at the very least to deny any form of theism in general. This was the hijacking of Darwinism. T.H. Huxley was an atheist that used the Darwinian evolution and linked it to atheism. He was debating people of religion, and this is what actually caused Darwin himself to start writing about his belief in God and called it absurd. I quote, he calls it absurd that you couldn't be a theist at the same time still accept his version of evolution. Coming soon was Julian Huxley, was actually the grandson of T.H. Huxley, who actually wanted people to become atheists. He had this want to make everybody around him an atheist. He said that for the modern man, the new religion is Darwinism. And look at today. He's exactly right. He wrote an entire book about this topic, and he argues that the same way that today nobody believes that the world is flat, in the future, nobody will believe that God exists. He was the man who turned Darwinism into a religion and made it directly oppose atheism when Darwin himself didn't say anything of that nature. Coming up next was Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins was a firm atheist, an evolutionary biologist that wrote a book titled The God Delusion. You probably heard about it in the past, where he uses Darwinian evolution as a source to disprove God. Later he says in an interview with Lawrence Krauss that if people think to believe in evolution, you need to be an atheist, then all I need to do is convince them of evolution and make them all atheists. This guy wanted people. This guy wanted people to become an atheist. He had this need. The same way that those guys knock on your door, hi, can you please talk about the love of our Lord? This guy was the same exact thing as the door knockers, but for atheism. Honestly, he did a damn good job because nearly everybody I know in real life thinks that this is the case. People in real life that I know think that to believe in evolution, you have to be an atheist. Now, naturalism starts to come into play. This ideology is scary. Now, the atheists that I've just mentioned would actually have to accept naturalism as their new age religion in accordance with their hijacked version of Darwinism, obviously. Naturalism is the idea that everything in the universe occurs only as a result of natural phenomena, of natural forces that exist within the universe that are totally measurable. That sounds pretty coherent, but if you don't believe in anything outside the universe or there's no room for divinity, this might make perfect sense to you. But there's a few flaws in this school of thought, to say the least. The worst of is that you cannot believe in free will and believe in naturalism at the same exact time. They actually go against each other. Because if you believe that everything in the universe only occurs as a result of natural phenomena, then even the thoughts you're having, all the physical and empirical measurable processes happening inside of your brain, all the decisions that you make may be a result of neurons firing a certain way and chemicals being affected by the natural forces in the world, which free will doesn't even hold room for. So if you're a naturalist, free will is contradictory to your belief, and if someone decides to do harm to somebody, it can't be their fault because this is a result of natural forces and natural phenomena. So you can't blame that person for doing the worst thing in the world. It's not their fault, it's the natural forces' fault, right? Who are they? How can you blame them? Because all they are is just a clump of cells and neurons firing inside their brain. To be a naturalist, you have to believe that there is no you, there is no soul. Nothing makes you you besides the physical flesh and brain and sack of flesh that you're living in currently. This is all you are basically, just this physical thing that I'm looking at right now. But if you believe in this, then if somebody steals something from you, for an example, it's not their fault because it's a result of their environment. It's a result of their poverty. That's what caused them to actually go and steal. So they can't be punished for it, and you have to completely neglect the fact that this person is actually guilty. If every single decision their brain makes is just a result of the natural and physical forces acting on it, then there is no self to hold accountable for any actions. This is pure delusion. Without separation of the mind and the body, there can be no such thing as free will. So instead of punishing somebody for doing something really, really bad, we can't hold anybody accountable. Instead of punishment, we should just tell them to just don't do it next time, or just give them some rehab instead. Another reason that you're not only a sack of flesh with no soul or no self is because, for an example, if we tear down a house and then rebuild it with every single part of this house being replaced, then we'd consider this house as being an entirely new house, right? Every single part changed. Similarly, the cells in our body do the same exact thing, except the retina cells that we have in our eyes. Nearly every single cell in our whole body replaces itself. So with that same logic, if you commit the biggest act of sin in the book, and all that person really is just their physical body, then you should release them from prison and drop the charges after the cells that committed the act have been renewed or destroyed. Because from a naturalistic point of view, that wasn't the same person that committed the act that caught them in prison for life. That was their old arm, that was their old body that has now been renewed and changed. So to be consistent with your argument, you would be delusional. Which you are. The Big Bang and evolution not being a choice of man or God, but it's natural selection, natural phenomena, random DNA mutations. If you believe in this, then you can't blame a divine deity for creation or being the force behind the Big Bang, the same way that you can't blame a human being for anything, since it's all random. However, there's no such thing as randomness. Randomness is a concept which is a byproduct of our lack of knowledge. There is no true randomness anywhere in the entire universe. If I roll a dice, for an example, I don't have enough information to tell which number is going to land on based on the air particles and the strength of my hand and the throw velocity and gravity and all of these forces that are actually at play, which means that nothing in the universe is truly random. We can call it random because we don't know much about it. It means that we're ignorant to the true calculation of the events. All events occur as a result of their cause. That means a cause is the only cause of an event. If there is nothing and nothing causes something to exist, then nothing can exist. There is no possibility of it randomly existing, not even in the slightest chance. Since something has to cause it to happen, then if nothing causes an event to occur, the event won't occur. So there had to have been a source, there had to have been a necessary, a non-contingent, a being that has pure free will that actually decided to make the contingent thing, which we all are, the entire universe is. It must have the creative capacity to create that contingent thing. It must have the ability to create that contingent thing through its intelligence. And that's how we can come to the conclusion that God does exist. It is necessary for the non-contingent thing, let's say is God, to have the free will to decide to make the contingent thing. It must also have the creative capacity to create this contingent thing, and it must have the ability to create it through its intelligence and its power. This is how we can come to the conclusion that there has to be a divine creator behind us, and now we can start to accept the more rational beliefs like, I'm not just a sack of flesh. If you look at our mitochondria, we have mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother and doesn't undergo any sort of variation. This means that we can trace all mitochondrial DNA in every single modern human alive right now back to one single woman. This is called the mitochondrial Eve, and this is thought to be a single woman who survived a genetic bottleneck. While all other women died, or either couldn't give birth, were infertile, or died, she was the only one who stayed alive and was fertile. We can't verify this as a fact, since she was the only person alive, and we can't say this is a solid fact, but I mean, rationally we can come to that conclusion because there's no evidence otherwise. The minimum gene count is about 525, though the exact number is disputed. There is a minimum number of genes that are required for even the most basic forms of life to have life. The genes have to work in perfect order, and abiogenesis, the theory that we came from amino acids in a hot pool of water, totally misses the mark on the complexity of even the most basic forms of life. The genes all have to be in the correct order and bonded by hydrogen bonds and further strengthened by pi-pi interactions. They must also be broken up by enzymes to replicate. So the rarity of this happening naturally is like hitting the lottery every single day for the rest of your whole life, and then your entire lineage doing the same exact thing. It's just impossible. Through the study of modern genetics, we can understand that these small genetic mutations can have severe impacts on the rest of the genome and can drastically reduce the organism's chances of survival despite the advantageous characteristics gained. The complexity of religious temples built around 10,000 years ago called the Göbekli Tepe shows us that we knew very little about the humans' knowledge during this somewhat recent time. They had built precise engravings into stones, multi-level structures. They made even an oracle room to make and reverberate vocal sound effects to make a powerful acoustic sound. They have richly decorated geometrical patterns of spirals. And because of this, we can understand that it wasn't made for living, had very few or no permanent residents. This site is significant because it goes against the notion that humans were hunter-gatherers at this time, and it highlights inaccuracies within our modern understanding of only 10,000-year-old, very recent human beings. While this argument is not really related to the theory of evolution, it plays a big role in showing how weak our understanding of the past really is. We can't just dismiss their precise and innovative architecture because it shows a lot about them as people. Like when an artist makes a beautiful painting, we can tell about the genius and intelligence behind it. Same kind of concept applies here. Many animals, especially mammals, have psychological adaptations to kill or to eat their deformed young. Now, these animals are literally wired to delete their offsprings if they show large changes in phenotype, like chromosome number changes, for an example. So with that said, if a vast change in animals is nearly impossible because of this, then how would they be able to evolve? If they would just delete the animals who show large changes in phenotype, this mechanism actually actively stops evolution and the chances of advantageous characteristics being passed down to begin with. One thing about evolution is that it doesn't explain complex emotions that are disadvantageous to survival. Emotions unique to intelligent life, such as sympathy or empathy, can lead to hesitation or even death when hunting a prey or when fighting for territory from the members of the same exact species. The ability for humans to have an addiction mechanism, for an example, or even feel guilt or have the capacity for higher thought are all actually bad for evolution, but we have these things. These emotions shouldn't have been naturally selected because they're disadvantageous for the species and could potentially lead to its demise. So these things, they get passed down into us, when in reality, if we're just all natural selection, like with no limits at all, then we shouldn't have sympathy, empathy, the addiction mechanism, higher thought, and all of the above. Evolutionary psychologists cannot explain the brain's complexity from an evolutionary standpoint, so they make each part of the brain independent and make it seem like each part of the brain is dedicated to a specific function, which actually isn't true. The neocortex is developed over time through synaptic plasticity and not strictly modular, so they totally missed the mark on this once again, warping reality to supplement their theory of evolution, like I mentioned in the very beginning. Now, if this neo-Darwinian form of evolution was true, then we'd be surrounded by a bunch of different transitional forms of different creatures, which we're obviously not. The basic building block of life is ATP. You probably heard about it, adenosine triphosphate. It's an energy-carrying molecule that sometimes is referred to as the fuel of life because it's the universal energy source for all living cells. Every living organism consists of cells that rely on ATP to make for their energy needs. The process of making ATP, though, requires 2 ATP to already exist. And this poses the question, how was the very first ATP ever created if it requires 2 ATP to exist? It's like a chicken and egg kind of theory. Glycolysis is a process that kickstarts the production of ATP. It converts the glucose into a form that the body can actually use to begin the Krebs cycle. This process requires 2 enzymes, hexokinase and phosphofructokinase. It's a long name. Phosphofructokinase. These two require ATP to break down the substrate. These are specifically folded enzymes with a globular structure, which allow the glucose 6-phosphate to enter a lock and key mechanism and break down the fructose 6-phosphate. Oh, here we go. Humans and apes share 95% of DNA, so we must have come from apes, right? Well, 60% of DNA is shared with humans and bananas, so we should be about half banana, and 98% is shared with a pig, and 90% is shared with a cat, 85% with a mouse, 84% with a dog, 80% with a cow. So with this logic, we must have come from apes, bananas, pigs, cats, dogs, cows, and mice. To the unlearned and impressionable mind, the fact that we share a large portion of DNA with a different species, for an example, or even a fruit, to say the least, it might be enticing to believe that we came from them. However, this is a very basic understanding of DNA and its roles in the human body. The Human Genome Project, which mapped around 98% of the genome, found that less than 2% of human DNA is actually active and carries any significance. To put this case to rest, though, a 2005 study from Pennsylvania State University claims and concludes that although nucleotide sequence identity between humans and chimpanzees is very high, only 20% of proteins are identical between the two species and 80% of proteins are different. Even the 80% protein differences appear to be too small to explain the phenotypic differences. Case closed. The difference in humans and apes goes all the way down to DNA splicing differences. This changes the way that the genes are expressed at a molecular level. But honestly, after the last point, I don't even have to explain this one. If you want to just read the source for yourself, go ahead and do so. I'm straight on explaining that. Humans and various mammals share deviated forms of the pentadactyl limb. For an example, apes have 5-finger bones, humans have 5-finger bones. Birds have 5 main bones in their wings, whales have 5 main bones in their fins, cats have 5 bones in their paws, and because of this, evolutionists use this as evidence that we must have come from a common ancestor, and that this common ancestor has a pentadactyl limb that we've taken that trait from. However, if we look into our evolutionary tree of life, we can see that the pentadactyl limb actually disappears and then reappears throughout history, so it's always coming and going. There's actually a PubMed study that proves this by Cameron Seiler and Raphael Brown that says, the results of our study join a nascent body of literature showing strong statistical support for character loss, followed by evolutionary reacquisition of complex structures associated with a generalized pentadactyl body form. Now, this proves that a once big proof of evolution is actually pointing towards its own disproof. It came back and slapped itself in the face, because if the limb can evolve and then de-evolve and then evolve again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we must have got it from a common ancestor, because it can always come and go between the different animals and species. Darwinists actually claim that we have some residual body parts and muscles left over from our previous evolutionary self that we actually don't even use anymore, that are totally pointless, that actually prove evolution. Let's disprove that. The ear muscles actually are not useless, even though you're told they probably were. The VOR, the vestibular ocular reflex, is a reflex within humans in which auditory cues such as fast clicks or tones can guide the eyes towards a location called gaze shift. The ABR and PAM are examples of such reflexes, starting with the superior ocular muscle, which was to be useless, when in reality, it's not. So these muscles actually provide strength and support to the ear, which is seen by cranial muscles, as well as supporting and guiding cartilage growth during development of the ear when you were a little baby. Darwinists claim that the appendix is useless and was once used to digest a heavy leaf diet. However, that's not true at all. The appendix is a part of the immune response and contains lymphoid cells. These are believed to be a part of the T and B lymphocytes mediated immune responses. Also, it acts as a backup for the digestive bacteria held within the human body. When a person suffers from a disease, for an example, such as chlorea, a lot of their digestive bacteria is actually flushed out in their GI tract, and the appendix can actually release the digestive bacteria to kickstart the gut microbiome for important digestion. Once again, a lack of knowledge plus a longing and desire to make the theory work is how anybody can come up with the idea that we don't need our appendix anymore and it does nothing for us. The palmaris longus is a muscle seen that is a remnant of evolution that is currently useless entirely, when in reality a new study actually shows us that 54% of the population has this muscle, but 96% of all elite athletes have this muscle. So further tests into sports that required grip strength also revealed that there's similar disparities, that when sports need you to actually grip something tough, this muscle does actually have some use. The human tailbone, this is definitely misrepresented as the remnants of a tail from our ape ancestors, when in reality it's actually connected to the pelvic floor muscles, providing balance for humans to stand up and sit up straight like I'm doing right now. An ape has 48 chromosomes and a human has 46 chromosomes. Now the theory says that chromosome 2 fused and to make it into 46. That's how we went from being apes to humans, or that's one of the proofs of it supposedly. But when a chromosome fuses, it gives rise to a satellite DNA that leaves behind a signature. At the fusion site, there is usually a lot of telomere signature, about 10,000 to 30,000 bases, but there's actually 768 bases at the supposed site, which is 10 times less than what is expected. The supposed fusion site also doesn't fit the traditional chromosomal fusion point use case. When a gene fuses, it has to fuse in a way that's like the least destructive, so that it tends to fuse at the least useful parts of the chromosome. However, this gene is expressed in over 255 different cell types and is co-expressed further with other genes. The fact that this gene is so active and strongly used, it kind of refutes the idea that this was a product of chromosomal DNA fusion and that we once had 48 chromosomes back when we were apes. It doesn't really make sense. Also, another point is that the organism that received this chromosomal fusion would have fewer chromosomes than its partners and look very different, and even if it did survive, it would not be able to pass on its genes and chromosomes because you can't viably reproduce with someone that has more or less genes than you. They have to be the same amount. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is a nerve that goes from your lower brain to your aortic arch and then back to your larynx. Now, the evolutionary biologists claim, why didn't it go straight from your brain to your larynx? Why does it have to go to your aortic arch instead? Now, they say this is either an imperfect creation, disproving God, is this some sort of evolutionary residue? So they get this because fishes also have this, and they also have multiple aortic arches because they have oxygen coming in from one direction and they have blood traveling in the other, so they have to have multiple. The theory claims that humans evolved from fish, and this would be their proof of it. Now, since this makes sense for fish but not for humans, they claim since we don't have multiple aortic arches today, then the one that we have is a result of back when we were fish, or a residue of evolution of some sort, and is actually currently pointless. However, as babies, as like a 4-week-old fetus, we do have multiple aortic arches, and it makes sense to have the nerve go through the main aortic arch that we have today, because as a fetus, we need the nerve to go around the arch in order to work and ensure that the larynx develops properly. Now, we can see this definitely does make sense. At 4 weeks old, we have to have this so that we can develop properly, but instead of that, these evolutionary biologists start to claim, oh, we have something that we don't know the answer to, evolution. It has to be it. We're going to draw all the evidence to the conclusion every single time, and never the other way around, like I continue to mention to you. Now, this is an example of true evolution that we can actually witness, prove, and empirically study instead of making these bold, outrageous claims. That is our wisdom teeth, for an example. I obviously agree with this. Maybe our ancestors had more primitive diets that consisted of like tough meats, raw plants, hard nuts. Our wisdom teeth are actually remnants of our ancient diet and are proof of science-backed evolution, not baseless theories. So this, we all should agree with. But next, we have the Tibetan tribes that underwent the fastest genetic changes of all of human history to adapt to high altitudes. The tribes lived in the Tibetan Plateau, which was about 13,000 feet above sea level, and at such high altitudes, only like 40% of the oxygen that we get is what they would get up there. So they have to learn how to live or adapt to survive at such a low amounts of oxygen. The gene variation took place at the EPAS1 gene, which regulates the body's response to low oxygen environments, and their bodies adapt by carrying more oxygen-carrying pigment called hemoglobin. In only 3,000 years, the frequency of the gene grew from 10% to 90% in Tibetans. This is a legitimate example of evolution. We have concrete evidence that this gene variation actually did take place through natural selection to keep the Tibetan mountain tribes alive. We can prove this. We don't make the radical assumption that because they can more efficiently, use oxygen at higher altitudes means that they were previously birds. No, we just say that over 3,000 years, they had to make it live up there, so naturally they were naturally selected to have higher gene expression of the EPAS1 gene. We're not going to make those radical claims like these neo-Darwinists. The Bahu fishermen tribes in Southeast Asia have evolved 50% larger spleens than nearby communities. Even members of the tribe that actually didn't dive still had larger spleens, which shows us that it's a genetic variation and not just enlarged through training or practice, similar how freedivers would actually do it in today's time. They spent nearly 5 hours underwater every single day and could actually hold their breath for far longer than any other average human being could, obviously because of their variation in gene. The PDE10A gene was variation responsible for the thyroid function and spleen size. This tribe has adapted to their environment. They can hold their breath for longer. They can dive better. They have larger spleens, but because of this, we don't go and make the outrageous claims that they came from sharks, do we? This is an example of evidence-backed evolution. Similarly, we shouldn't go and make such an exaggerated claim saying that human beings came from apes. The fact that this is taught in school is a problem. You go from learning that factual evidence your entire life in school, and then by age 14, your biology teacher tells you that, yeah, we came from apes, and then you just have to believe it because here's the book and here's all the evidence. It's a theory. It's nothing more than a theory, but it's being taught as a fact. Neo-Darwinian evolution is biased, narrow-minded, and propagated similar to a religious cult that the followers of it claim to be so against. Thank you for all being here. I love you so much. If you want to debate further on this, I have a Discord down below. You can join that and debate all you want, or in the comments down below, or you can just cancel me on Twitter. Thank you for coming to the end of this video. I love you. Mwah. Stay dreaming, stay lucid. I'm out. Peace. Is Lucid crying?